There is a line in a medical textbook from 1842 that I have read over 100 times, and it still doesn't feel real. The line describes the surgical procedure for removing supernumerary digits from newborns, not as a rare intervention, not as a response to an unusual deformity, as a routine procedure, a standard practice, described with the same clinical detachment used for cutting an umbilical cord. The text notes that the additional digit, most commonly presenting adjacent to the fifth finger, should be ligated and removed within the first days of life before the infant is presented to the family. Before the infant is presented to the family. Read that again. The extra finger was removed before the parents saw the baby. Not because it was dangerous, not because it impaired function, because it wasn't supposed to be seen. Because its existence was supposed to be erased from the first moment of the child's life outside the womb. The surgery wasn't treating a condition, it was concealing one. I found this while researching the history of obstetric practices in 19th century America and Europe. I was looking at how birth practices changed as birth moved from the home to the hospital, from the midwife to the physician. And buried in the medical literature of the period, in the journals and the textbooks and the surgical manuals that documented the new institutional management of birth, I found references to supernumerary digit removal that were so frequent, so casual, so treated as ordinary that they forced a question I wasn't prepared to ask. How common was the extra finger? This raises the question that the modern world treats as settled, but that the historical record suggests is anything but. Because polydactyly, the condition of being born with more than 5 fingers per hand or more than 5 toes per foot, is not rare. It has never been rare. It is, in fact, one of the most common congenital variations in the human species, and the deeper I went into the prevalence data, the more I found that the word variation is doing an enormous amount of work to obscure what the numbers actually show. Pull up the epidemiological data yourself. The current global incidence of polydactyly varies by population. In certain African and African-descended populations, the incidence of postaxial polydactyly, an additional digit on the outer edge of the hand, is estimated at between 1 in every 101 in every 300 live births. 1 in 100, not 1 in 10,000, not 1 in a million, 1 in 100. In some studies, in some populations, the rate is even higher. In populations of European descent, the overall incidence is lower, but still far more common than most people imagine, estimated at roughly 1 in every 500 to 1,000 births. These are the current numbers, the numbers after over a century of routine surgical removal at birth, after over a century of a medical practice that eliminates the visible evidence of polydactyly before the child leaves the hospital, before the parents see it, before it enters the medical record in any way that the family might question. The current prevalence of polydactyly is the prevalence that remains despite a systematic century-long practice of removal and concealment. The deeper I went, the more the question shifted from how common is polydactyly to how common was it before the removal became routine. The silence was deafening, because the historical record suggests that the answer is significantly more common than modern medicine acknowledges. Medical texts from the 1700s and 1800s describe polydactyly with a frequency and a casualness that indicates not a rare anomaly, but a common variation. Benjamin Franklin wrote about polydactylous families in whom the trait passed through multiple generations as a dominant inheritance pattern. The Hyatt family of colonial Virginia was documented across several generations as having 6 fingers on each hand, with the trait appearing in roughly half of all offspring. a pattern consistent with autosomal dominant inheritance. These weren't isolated cases, they were documented lineages, families in which the sixth finger was the norm, not the exception, for generation after generation. And here's the detail that made me stop. In those families, the sixth finger was functional, not a nub, not a vestigial appendage. A fully formed, fully articulated, fully functional finger with normal bone structure, normal musculature, normal sensation, and normal range of motion. A finger that the individuals who had it could use, that they did use, that they incorporated into their grip, their craft, their daily function. A finger that, by every measure except the modern expectation of 5, was a finger. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now, go deeper into the anthropological record, because the historical evidence of polydactyly doesn't begin in colonial America. It stretches back thousands of years, and the cultural response to extra digits in the ancient world was radically different from the modern medical response. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who built the cliff dwellings of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde in the American Southwest. Archaeological evidence from Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house in Chaco Canyon, includes skeletal remains showing polydactyly at rates that significantly exceed the modern average. Not one skeleton, multiple. And the cultural artifacts found alongside them suggest that polydactylous individuals weren't stigmatized, they were venerated. Six-toed footprints were carved into the rock near sacred sites. Sandals with space for 6 toes have been found in archaeological deposits. The additional digit wasn't hidden. It was celebrated, displayed, given architectural and artistic significance that suggests the polydactylous individual held a specific and elevated social position. Pull up the Chaco Canyon research yourself. Look at the 6-toed footprints carved into stone near the Great Kivas. Look at the polydactylous skeletal remains found in high-status burial contexts. The archaeological evidence is clear. In at least one major pre-Columbian civilization, having 6 fingers or 6 toes was not a defect. It was a distinction, a mark of specialness, possibly a mark of spiritual authority. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across other ancient cultures. In Hindu iconography, deities are sometimes depicted with more than 5 fingers. In ancient Mesoamerican art, 6-fingered figures appear in contexts associated with divinity and power. In the biblical text of 2 Samuel, a giant of Gath is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits total. The description is specific. It's included in a text that doesn't waste words. The extra digits were noteworthy enough to record in Scripture, not as a deformity, as a feature associated in the biblical context with extraordinary size and power. The deeper I went into the cross-cultural treatment of polydactyly, the more I found a consistent pattern. Ancient cultures treated extra digits as significant, meaningful, sacred in some contexts. Modern medicine treats them as errors, defects, anomalies to be corrected before the infant leaves the delivery room. The shift from sacred to surgical happened during the same period that keeps appearing in every investigation I pursue. The period of institutional standardization. The period when the natural variation of the human body was being classified, categorized, and corrected by a medical establishment that was simultaneously consolidating its authority over what counted as normal. Here's where the genetics become critical. Because polydactyly is not a random mutation, it's a heritable trait. It follows Mendelian inheritance patterns. In many cases, it's autosomal dominant, meaning that a single copy of the gene variant is sufficient to produce the trait. If one parent carries the polydactyly gene, approximately 50% of their offspring will express it. This is basic genetics. And basic genetics has an implication that the medical practice of routine removal has obscured for over a century. If you remove the extra finger at birth and you do it before the family sees it, and you don't record it prominently in the medical history, and you treat it as a minor surgical correction rather than a significant genetic trait, you don't eliminate the gene. You conceal it. The child grows up with 5 fingers. They don't know they were born with 6. They marry. They have children. And roughly half of those children are born with 6 fingers. And the doctor removes the extra finger at birth. And the cycle continues. The gene persists. The trait persists. The expression is surgically erased in each generation, creating the illusion that it's becoming rarer when in fact it's being hidden. The deeper I went into the genetics, the more the century-long practice of routine removal started to look less like medicine and more like selective breeding by other means. Not genetic elimination, phenotypic concealment. The gene stays, the visible expression is removed, and the cultural perception shifts accordingly. People believe extra fingers are rare because they never see them. They never see them because they're removed at birth. They're removed at birth because they're considered abnormal. They're considered abnormal because people believe they're rare. The circularity is perfect, self-reinforcing, invisible. Now here's where I need you to look at something that the medical establishment treats as settled science, but that the historical evidence suggests is a much more recent judgment than we've been led to believe. The definition of normal: 5 fingers per hand, 5 toes per foot. This is normal. This is the standard. Anything else is a deviation that requires correction. But what makes 5 normal? Not what makes it common. What makes it normal? Because common and normal aren't the same thing. Brown eyes are more common than blue. We don't surgically correct blue eyes at birth. Left-handedness is less common than right-handedness. We no longer force left-handed children to write with their right hands, though we did for centuries, another example of institutional correction of natural variation that we've since recognized as misguided. The determination that 5 fingers is normal and 6 is abnormal isn't a biological law. It's a medical convention, a decision made by an institution at a specific moment in history and enforced through a practice that removes the evidence of variation before anyone can question whether the variation needed removing. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the history of medical normalization, because the extra finger isn't the only natural human variation that the medical establishment has treated as a defect requiring immediate correction. Intersex infants have been surgically altered at birth to conform to binary sex categories, a practice that is only now being questioned after decades of advocacy by intersex adults who were operated on without their consent. Unusual birthmarks, skin variations, ear shapes, minor structural differences. The medical system has a long history of correcting the body to match a template of normalcy that the institution defined and the institution enforces. Here's what I keep returning to: the functional question. Because if the 6th finger were truly a defect, it would impair function. It would create problems. It would be detrimental to the organism. That's what a defect is, a feature that reduces fitness. But the documented cases of functional polydactyly show the opposite. The additional finger, when fully formed, enhances grip. It expands the hand's functional surface. It provides additional dexterity. Studies of polydactylous individuals who retained their extra digits into adulthood show that they develop unique motor patterns that utilize the additional finger effectively. The brain adapts. The hand adapts. The extra finger isn't vestigial, it's functional. It's used. A functional feature that enhances capability and that is inherited through dominant genetics. That's not a defect. That's an advantage that the medical establishment has been surgically removing from newborns for over a century. I'm not telling you that humans are supposed to have 6 fingers. I'm not telling you that 5-fingered people are abnormal. I'm telling you that polydactyly is vastly more common than the modern world perceives, that it was common enough in historical populations to be documented as a normal family trait. that ancient cultures across multiple continents treated it as significant, meaningful, and in some cases, sacred. That the gene is dominant and heritable and has not been eliminated from the human population despite a century of routine surgical removal at birth. That the removal is performed on newborns before the family sees the child, creating a practice of concealment that prevents the true prevalence from being culturally visible. I'm asking why a functional, heritable, dominant genetic trait that appears in as many as 1 in 100 births in some populations is treated as a defect requiring immediate surgical correction. I'm asking why the removal is performed before the parents see the baby. I'm asking why the cultural record of every ancient civilization that documented polydactyly treated it as a mark of distinction rather than a deformity. I'm asking why the modern medical establishment made a different judgment during the exact period when it was consolidating its authority over what counts as a normal human body. I'm asking what the human hand was becoming before someone decided to stop it. I'm asking how many people alive today were born with 6 fingers and don't know it. How many carry a scar on the edge of their hand that they were told was nothing? How many were quietly corrected in their first hours of life, shaped to match a template they never consented to by a system that decided what normal looked like and enforced that decision with a scalpel before the child could open its eyes? Handed a 5-fingered hand and told it was the only kind there was.